The difference between having a great quarter, making your number, or reporting a bad quarter often comes down to the effectiveness of your sales team's discovery calls and demos. But how do you make sure your reps are doing the right things on their calls in order to finish the quarter strong? Well, introducing Gong.io, the #1 conversation intelligence platform for B2B sales teams. Gong helps you ensure your reps are doing deep discovery calls and crisp sales demos by recording, transcribing, and analyzing their calls. And Gong allows you to understand how well your playbook is being followed and analyze how well it's working so you can constantly move the needle on your win rates. Now, if you request a demo of Gong as a result of hearing this message, you'll get a free ebook copy of my award-winning book, Zero Time Selling, 10 Essential Steps to Accelerate Every Company's Sales. So go to gong.io/accelerate to request your no-obligation demo and get your copy of my award-winning book, Zero Time Selling. Again, that's gong.io/accelerate, gong.io/accelerate. So go there now and come back and enjoy today's episode. It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 557 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record. My guest today is David Griffin. David is the CEO of Vortini. It's a sales forecasting system. And we're going to talk about how to avoid creating lousy sales forecasts and the 5 steps you can take to create achievable and realistic forecasts. Now, before we get to David, let me remind you that today's show is brought to you in part by our friends at Gong.io. Gong analyzes your sales calls and demonstrations so you can understand what's working and what's not. It's a great coaching tool to help managers boost rep productivity. So check it out at gong.io/accelerate and get a free PDF copy of my award-winning book, Zero Time Selling. If you'd like to see the show notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/557. You get a timestamp breakdown of this conversation, actually all conversations on Accelerate there, so check it out. And if you haven't done so already, please take a minute, subscribe to this podcast. You can do that at iTunes or use the podcast app you're listening to the show on. Also, leave a review for us. If you get a second, just a quick review, because we're anxious to hear what we can do to make this a better experience for you. So, all right, let's jump into it. David Griffin, welcome to Accelerate.
Thank you very much.
So I open the show with a standard question for all my guests. In your opinion, what's the single biggest challenge facing sales reps today?
Well, I think there are many challenges, of course. I think what we tend to see is the level of competition just continues to increase quarter in, quarter out. So the ability to close sales predictably, to work very carefully with pipeline to get the best possible outcome, I think is probably where the biggest challenge lies.
So, I mean, when you say the level of competition is increasing, are you talking about the quantity of competitors or the quality of the competition, or both?
It's quantity, it's quality, and it's also that what we tend to find is that buyers are more informed than they perhaps have been in the past. So you don't really find yourself talking to people and it's a greenfield opportunity and you're introducing your stuff for the first time. You tend to be talking to people who have already made a significant investment in understanding the field. Mm-hmm. So it's a more it's a higher level, more informed sort of conversation that you have, I guess I'll put it like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of people that you're sort of talking about, hey, the customer's already partway through their buying process before we engaged. A lot of people in sales think that, hey, that's not what happens, right? It's the customer's not really engaged in the process till a salesperson talks to them. Are you seeing both cases or just that one?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm thinking back a number of years when I first got into business, we would have conversations with customers and they weren't necessarily aware of the competition because they hadn't done sufficient research. And as long as we could have a conversation around what we were offering and establish that it met their needs, we could perhaps avoid any discussion about the competition and any feature for feature type comparison. Mm-hmm. I just don't find that exists anymore.
Well, let's talk about forecasting then, because this is Vortini's specialty. Is give us a little bit of background on Vortini. What was the impetus to start the company, for instance?
The impetus to start the company was doing analytics around sales data. As I suspect you're aware, analytics around sales data is a fairly crowded marketplace. So we decided to specialize a bit and we looked at the market and tried to find core business processes that were not well supported with software solutions. And we very quickly identified forecasting as being something where we could add some value.
And what were you seeing in forecasting that said, hey, yeah, this is, besides the fact maybe people weren't focusing as much on it, but what were sort of the basic problems with forecasting that you were seeing, that you still see?
Okay, so this could be a long answer, so keep me honest. What we find is that people have invested heavily in their CRM systems, therefore they have a pipeline of opportunities. So if you think about this as a maturity model, if you like, people will start off thinking, well, I've got a pool of opportunities, I've got my pipeline, therefore my forecast simply falls straight out of that, job done. Then they realize that the pool of opportunities doesn't really tell them the whole story, and it certainly doesn't give them a remotely credible forecast. So what they tend to do then is they think, well, we need to have a discussion around the pipeline, and we need to create some scenarios around the pipeline. We need to reach a consensus, and we need to, probe people on some of their assumptions. And the way they do that is almost inevitably the same. They extract the pipeline of opportunities from the CRM. They put it into spreadsheets. They've emailed the spreadsheets to individual opportunity owners around the organization. Then the sales ops people have to manually aggregate these spreadsheets and send them up through the organization until, a week later you pop out at the top of the organization with a fully formed spreadsheet of which contains the forecast. The issue with that, of course, is that the data that was originally extracted from the CRM is now probably a week out of date. So
exactly.
Even at the instant you get that forecast, the only thing you can say about it with absolute certainty is it's old. So where we came into this was looking at this process and thought, you end up with a forecast that is clearly stale. Nobody really wants to believe in it. And the entire process has swallowed up large amounts of time from sales reps, from sales management, and from sales ops people coordinating the whole process. So clearly there needs to be a better way.
Well, I think that you raise a sort of a central point is that, at least in my experience over decades of sales experience, is that no one wants to believe the forecast anyway.
But I think we can agree that businesses need forecasts to operate. So you've got an interesting conundrum here, haven't you?
Right. Yeah. So how do you build credibility in a forecast? I think that really becomes sort of a central question. Is regardless of the method, whether it's Vortini or you're doing it manually through endless mind-numbing iterations of a spreadsheet, how do you build credibility in a forecast?
So I'm going to answer that, but let's perhaps first just mention why the forecast even matters. It depends very much on your business, of course, but
sure.
In many businesses, management will have set an expectation, perhaps with the board or with investors, they're going to bring in a certain amount of revenue. They're very keen to know if they can meet that commitment, and whether they're going to meet it or not, the more notice they get they are or are not on track is clearly going to help them in positioning and maneuvering around that commitment. So that's sort of one level. Of course, if you're a business that delivers
hardware,
something that you manufacture,
yes,
or indeed if you're a business that sells, even if you sell software, and printing a license, of course, has got it requires very, very little effort, but nonetheless, licenses are frequently sold with a services requirement because services are needed to deliver the license and to recognize the revenue. Then it's no use getting to the end of a quarter and discovering that either you've got a load of services people with nothing to do, or worse, you've overcommitted to customers that are now going to be disappointed because that you haven't got the resources to deliver on what you have promised them.
Right.
So, and of course, manufacturing is an even more extreme example of that. People that manufacture inventory that they then can't sell have to immediately start writing it down, and it just gets ugly from there. So, everybody, I think, agrees that the forecast is important. Your question was building credibility in it. The approach we take is this: we absolutely agree that the seed corn of the process, if you like, is the data that comes out of the CRM. The list of all the deals that people are currently working on is clearly the first input to the process. We've got a couple of other things that we care about a lot. One is we look at historical information. So history can be your guide. So let's take a very simple example. I've got an opportunity that has just gone into the negotiate phase, and I think I can close that opportunity in a week's time. You may look back at history, or our software may look back at history, and it may very quickly discover that I have never closed an opportunity of that value in that period of time. It's not to say I can't do it this time, but the point is that when the sales rep is talking to their manager, it gives the basis for a discussion about why it might be different this time. Equally, I may have committed to deliver an opportunity last quarter, and here I am again committing to deliver the same opportunity this quarter. It's not to say I can't do it. It simply creates the basis for a conversation to establish whether what is going into the forecast really is deliverable. So they're the first two elements. The third element is really around collaboration. A forecast, as I think I said at the beginning, doesn't simply fall out of the pipeline. The forecast is really creating a scenario around a pipeline. What do I think I can deliver? Can I pull some deals forward from next quarter? Should I be offering some discounts to accelerate deals? Do we have the resources even to deliver these deals? We're creating a scenario around it, and it's fairly complicated. So we see the creation of a credible forecast as being the combination of the pipeline, of course, historical information that supports the conversion of that pipeline, and a conversation, a collaboration around the delivery of the pipeline.
Well, I mean, the holy grail has been for a long time, just as you said earlier, is, press a button, out pops a forecast, a fully formed forecast. But I think what you're saying, as I understood correctly, is that, even with, tools like Vortini, analytics, other data inputting, that there still needs to be some level of human involvement in creating a credible forecast.
Yes, it's a discussion around that, and that discussion can only really be effective if the people in that discussion are provided with at least the historical evidence of what has been achieved in the past.
So let me ask you a question. So how do you get rid of what I think is one of the the most short-sighted forecasting tools I ever see is this whole weighted probability forecasting?
So
I mean, I think I give the analogy or the metaphor, I guess, is that, it's like trying, if you're saying, look, we're a certain way into our sales process, gives us a certain probability. First of all, it's unmindful of the fact that there could be 4 other vendors who are at the same stage, right? We have five companies submit a proposal. You don't all have 80% chance of winning. So
at that stage, you're up to 320% of the revenue, which would be
right.
bad for everybody.
So, but this is how companies do it, right? There was a discussion thread I was following this morning. People, this is the probabilities we assigned to certain stages of the deal. And if you say, well, the stage of a deal is the distance you've traveled, then I said, that's like trying to measure probability with a yardstick, which you just can't do. So why do companies continue to do this?
Probably because it's simple. I mean, you could certainly make it more elaborate. So, for example, rather than so for a start, the idea that when you get to the negotiate phase, as an example, you're 80% through the process, irrespective of the size of the deal, the nature of the sales rep, the nature of the competition. It's just not a very credible assumption. So we don't tend to pay an awful lot of attention to those percentages, or perhaps you think of it as being a percentage of the way through the process rather than the probability that you're actually going to win the deal at the end of the day. So we can certainly calculate better numbers, but I think it really comes down to having a conversation around the probability, the real possibility of bringing this in that deal, and that really requires a conversation that takes into account the competition for sure. But more than that, for example, if the procurement guy has just gone away on holiday for 3 weeks, we all know how these things become at risk if they just allow to linger too long in the pipeline. So all these sorts of factors will come out through a collaboration, but they won't come out through simply asserting that it's an 80% probability because I've reached a certain point in the cycle.
I agree 100%. So one thing that has always sort of struck me as curious, and I'm guilty of this myself, having managed sales teams, it never occurred to me to do this, but I think it's Philip Tetlock in his book Super Forecasters says that, one of the things we don't do that the research shows that we should do because it works is train people to become better forecasters. Is provide, it's a skill that can be trained. And if we provide people coaching and feedback, as we do on other skills, that you actually, at least based on research that was citing, you actually see improvement.
No question at all. I mean, that there are people that are optimistic, there are people that are pessimistic, and there are people who have a more scattered outcome, if you like. So, clearly training will help people with that process. So what we try to do is we can certainly measure the accuracy of people historically. So they can look back at a whole series of previous forecasts and they can see, yes, I constantly forecast 10% less than I'm actually able to deliver. So that's sort of useful feedback. But I think the other thing is in the forecasting process, through our product and perhaps through other ways people might arrive at some of these results, it becomes very clear what the information is that's being made available to everybody who's participating in the forecasting process, and that helps as well. So there's a certain amount of transparency here. I think if you perhaps give some people a spreadsheet with a list of opportunities, there might just be a moment of panic, maybe too strong a word, but they realize they're being asked to commit to a figure. And I think unless you provide a process around that, it allows people to step through their assumptions, then you're likely to get fairly random results.
Well, but you raised a good point, though, is that part of the reason I think that forecasting suffers is people are nervous about committing. And so I think what a lot of sales reps don't understand, I think even some sales managers, is that under forecasting and then coming through at the last minute is as bad as over forecasting and not hitting the number.
Yeah, few people recognize that. I mean, I think in terms of sins, then delivering more than you promised is way lower down the scale than delivering less than you promised. But nonetheless, it's an issue. If you think of an extreme case where a company has failed to manufacture everything that it should have manufactured to fulfill orders because it didn't have a decent forecast, or even where it's gone ahead with some projects and now realizes it needs more working capital to do the manufacturing, but it hasn't got the working capital because it committed to doing other things. So, whether you are under or over forecasting, there is a price to be paid.
Yeah, no, I can think back to my experience with companies that we were forecasting for manufacturing purposes. And there were several instances with people under forecasting, over delivering sort of routinely for a couple of quarters, which really created a problem because suddenly the product was on allocation and people weren't getting what they wanted, and then that's an opportunity for people to cancel and go buy from somebody else.
Yes, precisely. That's certainly an issue. I think the other thing is that when we think, we always talk about the forecast, but of course the forecast is made up of many smaller forecasts. Right. There are reps forecasting, there are teams forecasting. It goes up through the organization. The entire organization is forecasting. So we want to make certain that the organization as a whole is delivering on its commitments, but also we want those forecasts to make certain every part of the organization delivers on its commitments as well. All
right. Well, I want to talk about an article you'd written about 5 tips to avoid bad forecasts, which I thought was really interesting because there's a couple points in there I hadn't thought about myself before. And the first point was to ensure that your opportunities are realistic and achievable, which we sort of talked about. That's always an issue from day one is either too aggressive or under forecasting.
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time looking at CRM data, and certainly when we talk to people, their instant reaction can be, well, heck, I've got the CRM, it's cost me a lot of money, I have the opportunities in there, so the forecast simply falls out of the opportunities. But what we tend to see is that people use the opportunities as a list of all the things they're currently working on. But certainly in terms of the information they're recording against those opportunities, it's not really forecast ready. So one very simple example of that, have you noticed that close dates are always the last day of the month?
Yes.
Right.
Or quarter, right.
So they're not close dates.
No, absolutely not, right? So it seems like part of the issue is that, I don't know, maybe, quotas are too aggressive in some cases. Yeah, I think the problem sort of starts with management often, right? Is the targets you talk about, are they realistic and achievable at the opportunity level? But oftentimes the targets aren't realistic and achievable. And then, managers are sort of incented with metrics that are, have to do with pipeline coverage oftentimes, depending on the industry. And it's sort of like, a series of decisions that begets bad behavior.
Yeah, no question at all. I mean, if targets this year are set 15% higher than targets last year, then
irrespective,
it sounds like an aspiration rather than a real target. I think what we would hope is that through a process where all the assumptions around the forecast are understood and can be discussed, then it leads to an honest discussion about what can be achieved, rather than starting from the target and working back and claiming that you can make it, even though the evidence would suggest otherwise.
Well, let me ask a question. I was one I was going to ask later, but I'll bring it up now. Is so when you look forward in terms of sort of the future forecasting, how technology is evolving, in the sales space, do you still see the human element involved?
I think there's always a human element. I mean, certainly the ability to use simple statistics over history and then machine learning gives us a better starting point for a forecast. So the way we talk to people about it is, we know that nobody wants to spend a lot of time on forecasting. Nobody's ever going to, go into work all excited because today is forecasting day. It's not going to happen.
Unless they're an analyst.
That's probably true. But what we can do is we can make the process as simple as we possibly can. So what we do is we use some of these models to suggest a forecast for the sales reps and for the teams, and then effectively we're inviting them to go in and improve on the assumptions that we've made, because as you suggested, there's all this stuff in their heads. The procurement guy at the big account I expected to close next week has gone on holiday for 3 weeks. So there's all this stuff in people's heads that it may not be reflected anywhere else. The models that we use give a really good start, but they can't possibly do the whole job.
Well, the second point you bring up is managing biases, which is absolutely essential. But I guess the question that, as I was reading that, was like, okay, well, how do you do that? Right? I mean, is it through the feedback, that you give people on previous forecasts? I mean, how do you help people spot the biases, and then how do you help them proactively manage their own biases?
Well, you can certainly, of course, and this really comes back to the point about why forecasting in spreadsheets is probably not such a good idea. If the forecast only ever exists in a spreadsheet and it's separated from the CRM, then you lose the opportunity to compare that forecast with the results that actually came in on the quarter. If the whole lot is linked tightly together, then it's very easy to show how good people have been right throughout the organization at stating the forecast and then delivering on that forecast. So from a coaching point of view, you can just point back to the evidence. People can see it for themselves. They can see that they have a bias on to forecast under or over. So that helps people become more realistic about their forecast.
Yeah, and I think that's, as you talked about, is the transparency that's available today, given tools like CRM systems and your tool and so on, is that's a great, as I say, sunshine's always the great disinfectant, right? I mean, it's it really helps people sort of, I think, moderate certain behaviors that get infected into the forecast. I was talking to a client once, and they're saying, we're having a forecast meeting, we're going through the forecast, and I push back on certain things, and people really get upset about it, and advice about how to manage it. And I said, well, here's the rule of thumb I use, is that when you're in a pipeline review or forecast review meeting and you're challenging a rep on a specific account, I said, the more defensive they get, the worse the account is, right? The less like it is to close. So it's you just have to track behavior, as you sort of talked about in the article. Is if people are too defensive, then that's probably not a good opportunity.
Yeah, agreed. And the information that we use to form the basis of those conversations is available to everybody in the conversation. So at least people can assume, understand what evidence is being presented and can work around that. Yeah,
one point you brought up, which I really liked, was to get a good forecast, go back and revisit the long-term forecast. Make sure you're staying connected to the overall plan. And that's a sin that I see companies too often commit, which is they don't try to keep these two in alignment. What's happening this month, this quarter, with the long-term plan.
Yeah, that's right. But even inside quarters, so imagine a situation where we're at the start of the quarter, and in the first week or so, we create a forecast. One thing we're quite keen on is we can look back at history, and we can look at the way revenue has been delivered throughout the quarter. And in many organizations, it looks a bit like a hockey stick. Mm-hmm. Things start off a bit quiet, and then they get very exciting as you get closer to the end of the quarter. So what we can do with the forecast, and so in the current quarter, of course, we've got no idea where the quarter is going to end up, but the forecast hopefully gives us a good insight into that. We can look at how much of the forecast has been delivered. So let me take a simple example. We're on day 70, and on day 70, historically, we've always delivered, let's say, 75% of the overall revenue for the quarter, plus or minus a few percent. Therefore, in the current quarter, we should have delivered that much of the forecast. And if we haven't delivered that much of the forecast, that's a fairly good indication that we're probably not going to deliver the forecast. Mm-hmm. There's a very similar calculation with pipeline. We know how much pipeline we need. If we've got less pipeline at a certain stage in the quarter than we have had historically, then it's a fairly good indication that the quarter is going to be in difficulty. So what we're trying to do with the forecasting process is, even when we've completed the actual creation of the forecast, the instant we get a hint that that forecast has gone off track, we want to give the heads up to everybody involved on the simple basis that if they've got more time, or if they get that warning as early as possible, they've got more time to actually do something about it. There's just no point in discovering 3 days before the end of the quarter that you're not going to hit the quarter.
Yeah, well, I mean, you still see the statistics come out that's saying that anywhere from 50 to 80% of qualified opportunities in a pipeline don't close, within the assigned period. And, assuming there's some truth to that, right? Even at the low end. I mean, that's saying, hey, we've got I'll put it in a positive light, we've got a huge opportunity in front of us to improve our process and how we predict what's going to close.
Yeah, you're right. The opportunities that are in the pipeline and are expected to close in this quarter, they must either be won, lost, or deferred, and getting a better understanding up front as to what the outcome is going to be for each of those opportunities is the secret sauce of a good forecast.
Yeah, and I think, alluding to a point, or for harkening back to one I brought up earlier, it's just that, I think the incentives for pipeline coverage that we see managers have, or sometimes even the expectations put on reps, is I think they assume to a certain degree that there's not much rigor in the process, right? So that if there were more rigor in the process, that people had to understand how to defend a deal better, as I call it, defend a deal, win, lose, or defer, what's really going to happen, that perhaps they would actually find themselves working on fewer opportunities, but do a better job on them.
Which is important because it clearly hitting or meeting your commitments is very, very important. But equally, you've got to be very careful with the opportunities. You need to be converting as many of them as possible and not burning your way through them, because they do represent the basis of future wealth for the company.
Yeah. Well, so another point you brought up, which I thought was interesting, a data point in there I found really fascinating. You talk about you have to improve bad data and data input. And you quoted a research report saying that industry data shows that most sales representatives spend 4 hours per week manually entering data into CRM, which I can understand. But the part I thought was really interesting is with only about 40% accuracy. So what are they inputting that's so inaccurate?
I think the data might be accurate at an instant, but it's not necessarily updated particularly frequently. There's not a huge incentive to keep that information up to date. The value of the CRM to the salesperson is that it reminds them what they're currently working on, and it makes certain that they follow up in a timely fashion and all the rest of it. But the actual value they put against an opportunity or the precise close date, does it really matter? Well, probably not to the person working the opportunity, but of course it does to the organization who are looking to figure out when that revenue might get delivered.
Yeah, well, and I think that sort of gets back to, again, a point we spoke about earlier in terms of the ramifications of a good forecast. I think this is something that maybe is part of onboarding process, part of sales training, that management needs to do a better job overall impressing upon salespeople the importance of a forecast. I mean, not specific forecast, but forecasting in general, right? The impact it has on the entire organization, and it starts with the individual rep and working with them, coaching them to arrive at a more transparent understanding of what their pipeline really is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, explaining that impact is important. I think, apart from that, the other thing is we want to reduce the amount of time that people spend forecasting, because people first and foremost perceive that time spent forecasting is time they're not out selling.
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to a maybe perhaps different way of forecasting too. And we talked about the weighted probability nonsense that a lot of companies do. Is there a better way? I mean, sort of last question of this for today is there a better way? If you're at a rep level, for reps to sort of say, okay, indicate whether this deal is going to close today. Just as a binary, yes, 1 it is, 0 it's not, or what have you thought?
Yeah, I think the idea that pipeline stages are associated with percentages that are fixed across the business and across all shapes of deal is a bit of a curiosity at this stage. I think the process that is more important to us is that we use a machine learning type approach, and we look at history. And of course, you need to have history to do that, right. But we look at history to be able to make a very defendable assertion as to what the likely, not only the likely outcome of any particular opportunity, but also the time frame in which we expect it to close. So I think we're just moving away from fixed probabilities, which we know aren't realistic, and moving to a more statistically based approach is going to give us better outcomes.
Yeah, and especially, as you talked about earlier, if we can make that information available to the reps to say, yeah, you're forecasting your closes in 30 days, but we've looked at the history. Vortini looked at the history, and not so much, maybe 60 days.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're obviously not saying that it's impossible. We haven't got that information. We're just saying that it's not behavior that we have observed in the past, and this is a great start for a conversation to understand what really is going to happen this time. If you're confident you can bring in this deal in 3 days, whereas previously it's taken 3 months, fabulous. Let's talk it through.
Well, much as a successful sales process has a strong element to it of managing and mitigating risk for the buyer, so too does a strong forecasting process have elements of it of managing and mitigating risk for the company.
Absolutely true.
So, very parallel in many respects. Okay, yeah. David, thank you very much. Great conversation. So tell folks how they can find out more about Vortini and connect with you.
Okay, you can connect with us most easily at www.vortini.com. And I'm David Griffin. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, that Vortini is VORTINI.com, and David Griffin. So, David, thanks for spending time with us today. Friends, thank you for spending this time with me today. Come back, join me again tomorrow for another great episode of Accelerate. Until then, if you get a chance, really appreciate it. On whatever device you're listening to this, whatever application you're using, take a second, pause, subscribe, leave a review for Accelerate. We want to hear what we can do to serve you better. So thanks again for joining me. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.